Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. We are here with James Padden, fellow English chap, former colleague from CBRE Cambodia, and now the country manager for Hongkong Land here. So, morning, James. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
So this morning we'll be taking a look at the possible future path that we're likely to follow following COVID-19, and we'll be getting James's insights into some of the trends that we're likely to see around this pandemic and what it's going to do in terms of changing the nature of real estate in Cambodia. Next week, CBRE Cambodia will be hosting a series of webinars looking at something which is a growing facet of the real estate industry, in that the development of professional real estate advisors in Cambodia is growing quite rapidly. So our colleagues here will be looking at some of the trends around that HR matter and some of the skills and requirements needed to pursue a career in real estate. So James, just wanted to ask you for your insights. What led you to real estate, and what led you to do real estate in Cambodia?
Well, morning, James. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. Happy to take part in the conversation on this topic that's affecting everybody at the moment. Interesting, you're going to do a talk on careers in real estate. So yeah, I don't mind giving a bit of my background and what led me to be where I am here today. So I actually originally studied real estate and graduated in the UK back in 2009, which was just actually in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Actually, real estate opportunities in the UK back then were quite minimal, and I was fortunate and actually still enjoyed working with my family business then. But I'd always had aspirations to work in real estate and also overseas. So in 2014, I actually took a sabbatical and traveled around Southeast Asia, which seemed an interesting place to be. And I actually was exploring opportunities there, got in touch with the previous chairman actually of CBRE at the time in Thailand, and he had an opportunity in Cambodia. So I just jumped straight in, joined CBRE in Cambodia, originally in a multidisciplinary role, and then focusing on office agency. Then in 2017, an opportunity came up. I joined Hongkong Land, and that was a step I was pleased to take at that point. I'd always wanted to work on the developer side. So since then, I've been busy with Hongkong Land.
Great, thank you. I think it's a path that's well trodden by a lot of us guys here at CBRE Cambodia, and including in some cases the move to Hongkong Land. Can you tell us a bit more about what you guys are up to at Hongkong Land here in Cambodia? What has been going on for you guys recently, and what led the company to Cambodia?
Yeah, I think just finishing up on that, I think, just leading up to your seminar next week on careers in real estate, it is a very rewarding career path, as I'm sure you'll agree. I think for anybody looking at getting into the sector, and I think there's a real bright future in Cambodia, despite the initial or the short-term challenges that are ongoing at the moment. In terms of Hongkong Land, actually the company will be 130 years old this year. So Cambodia in its entirety is quite recent for Hongkong Land. The company entered in 2011, and our flagship project, for anybody who's not aware, is Exchange Square, which is a mixed-use project 16 floors of grade A office space with a retail podium. We also run a high quality service department, Central Mansions, and we have two smaller projects, one on Monivong Boulevard and then our most recent development, which is in the Riverside area on Sizawat Quay.
Great, so quite a mixture of industries there that you're touching on day to day. But in particular, just wanted to speak with you about what you've seen recently, obviously launching a retail-focused development at this time. Perhaps it's the most exposed sector that we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic and its fallout for real estate in Cambodia. So if you could give us a bit of flavor on that development, what it involves. Have you had to make any adjustments to that development during this period, or as a result of the impacts that we've seen?
Yeah, so obviously in real estate development, things take time. So when something like this comes about, you can't necessarily pick the timing of when things complete. So our new development just finished very recently. It's quite a small project, around 2,000 square meters. Will due to the location, will really be focused on kind of destination dining and leisure. It's a really good fit, and I think will complement and actually uplift the whole Riverside area. Timing, times such as this, it really becomes a focus for the tenant-landlord relationship. So we do understand that there's some difficulty in the timing respect. Therefore, we've kind of had some dialogue with the existing tenants. In terms of any adjustment for this situation, we did just allow a slight pushback on when people will start their business, which I think is very practical during the period. What we've seen is not only a bit of uncertainty in the business climate, but people have some supply chain issues. So fitting out materials, etc., things like this can see some delay.
Yeah, great. I think that's a really important message, actually. Having that dialogue early with your tenants seems to be one of the things that we've seen from landlords here, where they're finishing new developments, either retail, office, and even in some cases residential. They've been quite pragmatic in the discussions that they've had with tenants, and that seems to have gone down okay for this market, given the trajectory that we've been on with the pandemic, with the volume of cases being relatively low, and it appearing to be quite stable with minimal lockdown style approaches that we've seen here. So perhaps Cambodia is slightly less impacted for the longer term, maybe. How do you see it generally? If you had a viewpoint, how do you think this is going to play out over the longer term overall?
Yeah, I think it's really unprecedented for all of us alive today, but through human history, we have been through similar things. So I think it's actually a collective response can be to kind of have quite a negative outlook, but I think it's important everybody can look, have a positive outlook. We will get over this because we always have. It's just at the moment a matter of how quickly that will happen. As you said, I think what we're highly fortunate at this moment in Cambodia is that the actual virus has not reached the levels that it has in some other places. So despite there's been economic impact, the actual virus transmission has been quite low. So I think, recently in the last week or so, we've seen traffic on the streets coming back. Our shopping mall, we've seen actually increases in footfall of around 30%. So while people are still cautious, which is the right way to be, there's a chance that we are coming back to life, you know, and maybe within the month we can start to see a recovery happening. I think, you know, longer term, the difficult and the uncertain question is how quick the recovery will be. You know, we have seen, which is right, many companies just put decisions on hold during this time. So will they make those decisions again very quickly afterwards, or they delay further? We're not yet sure.
Yeah, I mean, the interconnectivity now of Cambodia's economy with the rest of the region is so much greater than it was in 2008, 2009, when the economic impacts and fallout of the GFC hit this market. So I think that impact has been slightly more multiplied in this current climate. Certainly for CBRE, when we're looking at the decisions being made by corporate occupiers, a lot of those have been facing delay or perhaps over the longer term an adjustment in terms of the focus of corporate occupier, in particular when we're looking at office tenants and the decision-making process that they're going through. Clearly there's going to be some adjustment there, both shorter-term impacts in that decisions have been delayed and maybe we won't see as much take-up this year as we were forecasting earlier in the year before the pandemic took hold, but also longer term, some impacts on workplace strategy around ensuring that social distancing measures, which perhaps in Cambodia are a little bit more relaxed than in other markets. But when we're looking at an international occupier and they're meeting standards, there will obviously be a lot more flow through in that sector than maybe a domestic market, domestic company. So definitely some impacts there. Your view on longer term strategy strength in the office market here?
I think my view is that the current situation, I don't think it will make any fundamental new changes, but it may accelerate some of the trends that we've been hearing and observing kind of already. So I think, you know, one of the things CBRE has talked about over a few years already is in terms of kind of workplace efficiency, you know, maximizing the space that you do have, you know, in terms of, you know, looking at meeting rooms, are they fully productive, using workplaces, talent retention and attraction strategy. I think COVID has seen this proliferation of these new tools such as Zoom, which we're using today, Microsoft Teams, and these have shown themselves to be quite effective and complementary to existing workplace kind of or traditional ways of working. So I don't think we're going to see a situation following some of the headlines like, is it the end of the office? And I think I've even seen in some places conversation of a company is going to need more space so tenants can sit further away. I think as a commercial landlord, that would be a good a positive change. I honestly don't think that will happen either. I think it will kind of carry on as it has, but maybe we'll see more flexibility in working hours. People will be allowed to work some time from home. These tools will become more commonplace. I think, you know, they can complement existing meetings, you know, and then the ongoing trend of co-working, maybe that kind of strategy also just continues. So I think there's not going to be a fundamental change. In the short term, we'll probably see existing and continuing hygiene measures in place, so office thermal scanning, you know, those kind of things.
Yeah, I think you're right. The viewpoint on expanding the office in order to keep social distancing measures seems to be maybe looking at the situation too positively. I think I'm in agreement with you that agile working and ensuring that we see some adjustment in terms of how people approach the office? Do they continue to work from home more, have more flexible approaches using cloud technology? We've seen quite a bit of push from that sector over the last few years, but definitely now for corporates and occupiers to be investing in those kind of technologies that allow people to work from home. It's something that we've followed here, and I'm sure that you guys have also seen that kind of strategy happening even within your own business, where being able to work from home and having the flexibility maybe not to be in the office all the time is important, and it can relieve some pressure on the office at this time. It's certainly been very valuable for us being able to work remotely when we need to, even if it's just in a coffee shop or from home at the weekend. So definitely those trends looking at accelerating. And just skipping back slightly towards the retail sector and the impact on there, clearly some important trends coming out in terms of retail space and how that's going to move forward. I think our view, my take on retail in Cambodia has been following a fairly traditional growth path so far, in that brick and mortar development of retail space has been the primary focus. And sure, we've needed to upgrade and deliver more high quality international retail space, like the retail podium at Exchange Square and other retail developments that you guys have got and others have developed across the city. But clearly some pressure now on the retailers and probably on landlords to support and push ahead with some changes in the retail segment and how customers are approached and reached. How are you seeing that playing out?
Yeah, I think again it's been an accelerator. It's been no getting away from the fact it's been a very challenging time for retail and hospitality business, not only in Cambodia but globally. I agree with what you're saying. Actually, I think that the growth path of retail has been quite traditional and mainly focused on bricks and mortar. Whereas while it's been challenging, it's actually been a time of quite a lot of innovation. I think before this situation, there was not many of the restaurants, for example, were not on the delivery platforms, whereas now I think that must be at almost 100%. The likes of NAM24 and these localized delivery systems have really grown, and that's come outside of F&B now as well. We're seeing more traditional kind of e-commerce situations. I think where maybe 10, 15 years ago in other markets, somebody like Amazon would have to build an entire infrastructure. Now, kind of with technology as it is, there's kind of partnerships. So you've got delivery companies, apps like Gojek in Jakarta. They can kind of work together. So, the online payment transfers, these can all kind of interconnect to make probably the cost of going online and the process much simpler for retail. So I think we're seeing omni-channel will really grow in Cambodia over a hugely accelerated rate. And then I think that will also have some stickiness. And when we return to normal condition, the online will complement the offline model. So retailers will then have, another channel that's more developed as part of their sales strategy.
Yeah, really interesting, the change in terms of the resources that are required to deliver those services. So scaling up on the last mile logistics and delivery services, and then scaling back on in-store resources at the moment. So a lot of movement in terms of the deployment of resources in the retail segment, and potentially just some adjustment in terms of the format of future retail stores. So maybe not quite as deep as we've seen before, and more of a storefront style. That's what we generally see when markets develop towards omni-channel, in that the bricks and mortar store becomes slightly less important, but the frontage space is clearly what the retailers are after. So usually some adjustment in terms of the format, and usually it's possible to do that and amend the back of house format of retail segments, retail centres to allow more flexibility in terms of warehousing and the fulfillment of last mile logistics and other aspects that need to go on to support that kind of retailing. So maybe some slight adjustment in the future for retail projects that we see come through if these trends do stick. And that means some adjustment in terms of how retail is priced for Cambodian landlords. And obviously, Hongkong Land also involved, as you mentioned earlier, in the service apartment market. We've certainly seen a bit of impact on that segment as some expatriates have vacated, whilst others are certainly sticking around and looking for long-term occupancy. Some changes there over the long term in that home working and the facilities management required behind service apartments is probably going to shift slightly, but perhaps maybe not the same level of adjustment that we might see in the commercial segment. Any thoughts on residential here? We see a lot of difficulty for developers and landlords at the moment in terms of attracting buyers and occupiers, and we're seeing a lot of hotels now starting to come through and offer longer term occupancy packages. Any thoughts there?
I think, as you say, during this time, business travel is has ground to a halt. So that part of the market is on hold. The people who are living in Cambodia will still need a place to live. So it's kind of, I think, in that sense, it's quite stable. On a longer term horizon, if working from home does become more commonplace, then I think there'll be value added in extra facilities like meeting rooms or kind of comfortable workspaces that could maybe be integrated into these residential developments. And then again, I think along the same line as companies making delaying decisions, I think individual buyers also are probably going to fit in that category at this moment. So it may be a case it's frustrated demand and it will come back once there's more clarity on the situation. One other sector I think you briefly touched on, logistics and warehousing. One of the first things we started to see when the situation really took hold in China was how it acutely affected the supply chains of many companies. And I think while it's too early to see immediate changes at this moment, I think a lot of companies saw the effect that had and possibly realized that their supply chains are too exposed to one geographic location. I think that's going to give certainly some opportunity to Cambodia in terms of the industrial sector. Maybe people are going to try and diversify their supply chains. So countries like Cambodia and Vietnam may see longer term demand coming out of China.
Yeah, definitely. And there are lots of things that government could do to support that growth. So at the moment, if we look at where Cambodia is sitting in terms of industrial and warehousing development comparative to Thailand and Vietnam, it's quite a significant way behind, particularly Vietnam, which over the last 3-5 years has really taken off in that segment. So I think there's some really key aspects there that government can play on to help that sector look and feel more competitive than maybe it does at the moment, with the growth and the push for SEZs and other various incentives on tax and ownership structures and formats, for example. Yeah, so clearly a lot of adjustment happening in the market, and probably some need to again look at shifting the regulations around real estate from government. If Hongkong Land could have anything with regards to a wish list on regulation for real estate, what would you be looking for in terms of upscaling the attractiveness and competitiveness of Cambodia's real estate sector?
I think, just private sector and government just need to continue dialogue and work together to just, continue to build trust in what is an emerging market. So, higher levels of transparency and rule of law, these kind of things will really help give confidence to inbound investment. And where that can happen, feel there's more comfort. That can only be a positive, have a positive impact on investment in Cambodia. Where it's seen as coming up the list in terms of somewhere people would be comfortable to invest.
Yeah, definitely, and transparency and ensuring that we've got regulations that are clear and concise, and people know what they are and what the impacts of those regulations mean for their investment. Quite key. Just to say, if anyone does want to ask questions, the Q&A button is available, so do go in there. You can vote for any questions that you want us to answer. And as long as they're reasonable, we'll have a good look and try and get to those shortly. So I think we've kind of covered quite a bit of the market. Any key takeaways that you're seeing, James, just to wrap up?
I think it's obviously tested everybody. A lot of companies have a BCP or business continuity. This has been a time of really testing that. So people have found what needs to be changed, and really worked through the plans that they did have. This is the time it's needed. From a landlord side, it's really been a time about focusing on the relationship with tenants. Having dialogue, understanding if they have concerns. And then I think, safety is the #1 priority. So we've, our property management team have done a really good job working with tenants, putting in safety measures, which I think I've observed all the landlords, I think have done quite a good job here in terms of putting in temperature control, hygiene measures. Our tenants, have also put in kind of social distancing measures where there's queue situations. So I think everybody has really worked together to try and look after each other, which has been positive to see. And I think some of these measures will probably stay in place over the short term while we observe, how long it's going to go on and when we're clear to move back to normal.
Yeah, significant amount of change, a lot of opportunity to see acceleration in trends that we've been observing for a while and been talking about. Cambodia's still got some way to move up the real estate development curve, and often what we find with situations like this is that spending on recovery and putting in place practices, policies, procedures increases significantly to ensure that businesses and even buildings are more resilient for the future. So as well as being very disruptive and difficult to deal with, the situation also presents opportunities for the market to change, evolve, develop through to a slightly more advanced position maybe than it has been sitting at. So some good potentially in globalizing the market further slightly. So we've got 2 questions so far. One is around stimulus extended by major commercial property landlords and a general approach to assist the retail sector. So I think from what CBRE have been seeing, there's no consistent approach that's applied. Obviously, some general comments from the government for landlords to assist tenants, but very much on a piecemeal basis. Any comments on that one, James?
Yeah, I think again, it's just about the relationship. The tenant and landlord having a healthy dialogue and discussing, how we can kind of ride this situation in the best way possible together. So as James said, there's not been a standardized approach or legislation in Cambodia, but I think, the tenants do and the landlords have an obligation to work together to see what the best way is forward to get through. Yeah. I think was the one other question as well.
There is, yeah. Do you think that the COVID crisis will have consequences in terms of hygienic standards or measures for offices and retail spaces over the long term? So I think we kind of touched on that, but perhaps just want to reiterate any specifics that you're seeing, anything that you're seeing other tenants do maybe slightly differently.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think a lot of these measures will stay in place at least for the short term, such as temperature scanning, additional hygiene measures spreading while we watch the situation. I wouldn't expect we'll see these things become a permanent feature, but I think, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and there's clearly some push from some areas of the market to move towards agile working, as we discussed earlier. So home working, both as a means for helping in this situation, but also for the future, adding flexibility and in some ways reducing their need for office space in particular, and as well as that, retail moving through omni-channel as a way of supporting hygiene standards and reducing demand on physical office space and physical retail space, but those put pressures elsewhere on the system. So we had one more question come in, which is about outside of Phnom Penh. So I know we've focused on Phnom Penh so far, but we will see what we can say about this. And in particular, the question is about Sinukville. So obviously at the moment, it's a very difficult situation for Sinukville, and this isn't just during this period of time. This is a trend that we've seen now for the last almost year, since the online gaming ban and the exodus that we saw of Chinese nationals from that market. Sinukville's been very quiet and has been resetting. But it looks like something of an opportunity for that market, I think, in that it did need to reset. The urban planning and urban fabric of the city was deteriorating under the immense amount of pressure that was ongoing in that market, given the volume of development that was happening. So potentially some upside there in that this period gives some further breathing space for Sinukville to reset. It is obviously incredibly difficult for anyone who has been building real estate there in the hope that the trends that we were seeing of very high market activity would continue. And once that market activity backed off, quite tricky. We're going to do quite a bit more looking at this segment over the next few weeks and months. So I hope that we'll be able to answer your question as to the future of Sinukville slightly more analytically. James, you've been here a long time now, and you've seen the rise and then the subsequent disruption for the Sinukville market. Any thoughts on Sinukville?
I think, yeah, obviously, I think there was a huge amount of speculative building, and it's highlighted where that is completely uncontrolled. You know, you can get an oversupply situation, and then that was coupled with the gaming ban, which was one of the major drivers of demand. So it's put the city in probably a challenging situation. I think, as you said, it was probably time for a reset. If there is increases in for example, warehouses in industrial, Sihanoukville is one of the provinces that could stand to benefit from that. So if that sector does keep continuing, you know, I think maybe that can have a positive effect and help the city kind of regenerate and come back from where it is today.
Great. And we've got a few more questions. There's one here from Frankie Go on tourism industries and particularly focused on Camp Hot. The moment tourism industry is just very difficult. I think we saw in the press last week that Angkor Wat was seeing 0.5% of normal activity at its ticket booths. And clearly that's a very dramatic statistic and highlights the difficulty for that segment. I think in most markets, the first pickup in hospitality is likely to be from domestic tourists. And whilst Cambodia hasn't seen much impact, linking to Maxim's question on health infrastructure, Cambodia's lack of health infrastructure during this time probably means that it may not be a target for international tourist volume until slightly later in the curve of this pandemic. Countries that have been able to contain the virus, even though they've had maybe higher levels than we've seen here, but where they have excellent healthcare facilities like Japan and Korea, may be the first in Asia Pacific to start to heat up. But there was some interesting stuff I saw last week between Australia and New Zealand on travel bubbles, where they agree a common set of standards for border control and allow domestic tourism, international tourism effectively between limited number of geographies. That could be a trend that we see more widely now that Australia and New Zealand have started that conversation. Perhaps domestic tourism or Southeast Asian tourism amongst maybe Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam in a bubble might be something that we see. I think it's perhaps a little further off than could be the case, in that the linkages with China seems still very strong, and the desire to bring those tourists back would appear to me to be quite healthy. Any thoughts on health infrastructure, tourism industry, James, to add in there?
Yeah, I think, as you said, it's probably going to start domestically, and then the funnel will kind of fill out from there. So I think when people are more comfortable domestic travel, kind of expatriates and Cambodian people living in Phnom Penh will start traveling around the country more to places like Camp Hot and Siem Reap, and then we'd expect whether there's kind of kind of government discussion or not, when travel opens up, the local Asian countries will see inter-country travel before we see kind of Europe and American markets returning, which may be a little bit further off.
Yeah, absolutely. So one final question from Jason about lack of infrastructure in Cambodia being a concern to foreign investors. Government policy not always favorable to foreign investors all the time. Well, sure, there is uncertainty with regards to infrastructure development. I think we've seen quite dramatic increases in the volume of work that's ongoing with road widening, highways, overpasses, whether those are funded by international business, government, or domestically. Quite a bit of change there. Of course, there still remains a level of uncertainty, and that happens in all markets. So when we look at infrastructure improvements, even in developed markets like the UK with HS2, which is still under scrutiny despite being many years into planning. The cost and investment involved in these decisions means they can change, and often do, either before or partway through. But clearly there's a series of good economic drivers behind improving infrastructure here as a way of supporting markets and developing new areas of the country and spreading economic development beyond Phnom Penh and areas around international airports, but as well as that improving capacity and supporting that for the long term. You make a comment about luxury retail. Retail has different segments, and luxury fits some buyers and not others. Does it fit normal Cambodians at the moment? Sure, no. But we've seen quite big strides in terms of consumer spending and the amount of disposable income that's available to many in the middle classes. But there has always got to be a range of different levels at which retail is focused. And I think we have said in previous discussions around the retail industry that the volume of supply that's coming at the moment is unlikely to be supported by the amount of disposable income at the moment, given that the volume of increase in supply is so significant. So diversifying that supply and offering a difference is key, as well as the target audience around the development. So I'm sure Hongkong Land have done a lot of study about the type of target audience that would be looking at their development on the riverside, which would be very different from community mall development on the edge of Phnom Penh, for example. You're looking at a different customer base. Anything to add there, James?
Yeah, I think the continued spending on infrastructure can only help, especially in Greater Phnom Penh, where you see better roadways and connection. That can only help those areas and their future potential. In terms of opportunities for foreign investors, I think Cambodia does have a lot of opportunity long term. We're seeing, still there's rapid increases in GDP per capita, earnings. So I think it's coming up the kind of the curve on quite a fast level, even from a low base. If you try and compare to other countries, so the best comparable probably Thailand and Vietnam, which is quite a few years ahead, but you're probably going to see some long-term changes in lifestyle. So you may start to see more of the younger population live closer in the city centre. Maybe the traditional way of living as a larger family may change people start having more demand to live in condos, which will have a long-term impact, positive impact on the residential market, and then consumer habits will change and continue to move from the traditional kind of retail formats into more shopping mall focused, as we've seen in Thailand and Vietnam.
Yeah, a lot of interconnected trends in there around society, even down to banking, finance, payment solutions, careers, everything moving ahead of pace here. So COVID-19 causing some disruption, but likely for short term, and then some longer term changes to how these things will develop. And in some cases, there'll be an acceleration of some of these trends which feed into the adjustments on some of those critical things that impact the real estate segment, and some which will undoubtedly cause some adjustment that's required to existing facilities. But often real estate developers are very open to discussion, and what we've seen so far is a lot of pragmatism and willingness to look at what is required in order to support occupiers. So I think that brings us neatly to the end of the discussion. I want to thank you all for joining and staying with us for this talk on the future post-COVID-19. And thank you for the questions. We will post this online a bit later if you want to revisit anything. And do reach out to myself if you have any follow-up questions. I'll be happy to pass on anything to James if that's needed. So thank you very much. Thank you, James. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And we will end things there. So thank you all very much.